Welcome to Warming Tales Frias. Today we dive into a gripping tale aboard a fully booked flight from Boston to San Francisco, where an undercover FBI agent, Derek Cole, finds himself confronted by an entitled passenger. As tensions rise and prejudice surfaces, Derek must navigate a storm of hostility and assumptions. Will he overcome the challenges thrown at him, or will ignorance win out? Make sure you hit that like button and subscribe for more captivating stories. Let's get started.
The flight from Boston to San Francisco was fully booked, and for Agent Derek Cole, it felt like just another ordinary day. Derek sat by the window, earbuds in, quietly listening to music as the plane taxied down the runway. Today, he wasn't in his usual attire, no suit, no tie. He opted for jeans and a simple black t-shirt, blending effortlessly with the other travelers. As an undercover agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Derek had learned to adapt to any environment. This wasn't a high-stakes mission or a dangerous operation. He was simply on his way to San Francisco for a standard briefing. Nothing remarkable. As the plane climbed, Derek casually scanned the cabin. It was a typical crowd: families, professionals, and tourists. His gaze settled briefly on a woman seated in first class. She had been making her presence known since before takeoff. Loud and brash. Dressed in designer clothes, covered in flashy gold jewelry, she wore an expression Derek recognized immediately. He'd encountered her type more times than he could count. The flight attendants had already begun murmuring about her. Ava, as Derek mentally labeled her, was the embodiment of entitlement. Every flight seemed to have someone like her. He sighed quietly. Today, she was on a mission to make sure no one else enjoyed the flight. She had already complained about the seat, the temperature, and the boarding process, anything that could draw attention. Derek kept to himself. His plan was simple: stay quiet, read, and wait for the flight to end. Unfortunately, things didn't stay peaceful for long. About an hour into the flight, as the attendants began serving drinks and snacks, Derek heard Ava's voice cutting through the general hum of conversation. She was arguing, loudly. "Excuse me, I asked for sparkling water. Not this. Whatever this is," she snapped, holding up a can of soda as if it were toxic waste. "Is this how you treat paying customers?" The flight attendant, clearly doing her best to stay professional, offered an apologetic smile. "I'm very sorry, ma'am. We've run out of sparkling water." Ava scoffed, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Pathetic," she muttered just loud enough for the flight attendant to hear. Derek noticed the attendant flinch slightly at the remark. Derek shook his head. He'd dealt with people like Ava before, arrogant, rude, and always seeking to ruin someone's day. He adjusted his earbuds, raising the volume to block out the noise. His focus remained on his book, determined not to engage. But Ava's attention wasn't so easily diverted. Moments after the flight attendant left, Derek stretched his legs, standing briefly near his seat. Ava's eyes locked onto him almost instantly. "Excuse me," she called out, waving a manicured hand in his direction. "You," in the back. Derek lowered his earbuds, raising an eyebrow as he realized she was addressing him. "You need to sit down," Ava said sharply. "You're blocking the aisle." Derek glanced around. He wasn't in the aisle, just standing near his seat, well out of anyone's way. Calmly, he replied, "I'm not blocking anything, ma'am. I'll sit in a moment." Her eyes narrowed. "Don't ma'am me," she snapped. "I've been watching you since we boarded, acting like you own the place. This isn't some street corner you can loiter on. People like you always think the rules don't apply." Derek's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what she meant by "people like you." The words hung in the air, heavy and familiar. "I beg your pardon?" Derek said, keeping his voice even, though irritation simmered beneath the surface. "You heard me," Ava shot back, her voice rising. "I don't know how someone like you even made it on this flight, but you need to learn your place. I paid good money for this seat. I won't have your kind making it unbearable." A hush fell over the nearby passengers. Eyes flickered between Derek and Ava, but no one stepped in. Some whispered quietly, while others simply stared in uncomfortable silence. The flight attendants hadn't intervened yet, seemingly hoping the situation would diffuse on its own. Derek remained composed. "I'm just flying like everyone else, ma'am. There's no need for this to escalate." But Ava wasn't interested in de-escalation. "Oh, so now you're the victim," she sneered, her words dripping with sarcasm. That's always the way, isn't it? I've seen how you were glaring at me since we boarded. Entitled, like the world owes you something. Maybe I should call security when we land. Derek inhaled slowly, willing himself to stay calm. Ava's outburst had gone from rude to outright hostile, but he wouldn't give her the reaction she wanted. Before he could say anything more, she took it a step further. You probably don't even belong in this country, she spat, loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear. I bet you're just here to take advantage of hardworking people like me. Derek's fists clenched, but he forced himself to relax. This wasn't his first time facing something like this, but somehow, it never got easier. This isn't over, Ava hissed, her arms tightly crossed as she glared at Derek from across the cabin. Derek could feel the weight of every gaze on him. The tension in the air was almost suffocating. He kept his breathing steady, refusing to let his frustration show. Years of training in the FBI had prepared him for intense situations, but no amount of training made these moments feel any less personal. Ava's words hung in the air like smoke, lingering long after she sat down. If it were up to me, she continued loudly, not bothering to hide her disdain, freeloaders like him wouldn't even be allowed on planes. Always taking from hardworking people like me. Derek clenched his fists at his sides, knuckles turning white. He forced himself to relax. This wasn't the first time he'd dealt with blatant prejudice, but somehow it never got easier. As if sensing his restraint, Ava's voice rose again. Somebody needs to put you in your place, she practically shouted, standing now and pointing directly at Derek. All eyes were on him once more. The cabin was silent, except for the distant hum of the engines. The flight attendants, clearly frazzled, whispered to each other but seemed unsure of how to step in. Derek glanced toward them but saw hesitation in their eyes. I said sit down, Ava barked again. You're making everyone uncomfortable. Derek stayed calm, keeping his gaze on her, but not engaging. He knew from experience that feeding into her rage would only escalate things further, but that didn't make it easier to endure. A young woman seated closer to the front of the cabin leaned toward a flight attendant. Are you going to do something? She asked in a hushed but urgent voice. This is getting ridiculous. The flight attendant nodded and began to move toward Ava, but before she could speak, Ava held up her hand dismissively. I don't need you to tell me how to behave, Ava snapped at the attendant. Just do your job and remove him from this plane. The flight attendant paused, visibly unsure whether to intervene or step back. Derek could see her internal struggle, fear of making the situation worse. He didn't blame her. He had witnessed these moments spiral out of control before. Still, Derek knew this couldn't continue. Ma'am, he said, his voice calm and level, but firm enough to carry across the cabin. I haven't done anything to you. Please sit down and enjoy the flight. His restraint only seemed to fuel Ava's anger. Don't tell me what to do, she shrieked, her voice trembling with rage. You people are all the same. Always playing the victim. Always acting like the world owes you something. I know your type. The entire cabin seemed to freeze. Some passengers exchanged uneasy glances, while others looked away uncomfortably. Derek could feel the heat rising inside him, but he stayed grounded. Reacting emotionally would only serve her agenda. Suddenly, a man from the row behind Derek stood up. He was broad-shouldered, with a steady and authoritative presence. Lady, you need to calm down, the man said sharply. His voice was firm but devoid of aggression. You're out of line. Ava whipped around, narrowing her eyes at him. Don't you dare tell me to calm down, she spat. I'm the one being harassed here. I paid for this seat and I deserve respect. The man folded his arms across his chest. You're not the one being harassed. Look around, no one's on your side. You're embarrassing yourself. A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the passengers nearby. Several nodded in quiet support. The tide was shifting. Ava's face turned bright red, her lips trembling with fury. I'll have all of you removed, she yelled, scanning the cabin. You're just jealous because I'm not afraid to speak the truth. Derek took a deep breath, glancing toward the flight attendants. They were still hesitating, unsure how to proceed. Then, before the situation could escalate further, another voice rang out from the front of the plane. Ma'am, you need to sit down, now. The authoritative tone belonged to the pilot. He had emerged from the cockpit, his calm but commanding presence drawing immediate attention. Ava's eyes widened in surprise. Her mouth opened as if to protest, but the pilot raised his hand. "This behavior will not be tolerated on this flight," he said, his voice unwavering. "Either you sit down and stop causing a disturbance, or we will turn this plane around." For the first time since the confrontation began, Ava hesitated. She glanced around the cabin, noticing the stares of disapproval from the other passengers. The realization that she no longer had control of the situation seemed to hit her all at once. Still, she wasn't ready to give in. Crossing her arms tightly, Ava sank back into her seat, glaring at Derek. "This isn't over," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for him to hear. Derek didn't respond. He simply exhaled quietly, steadying himself for the remainder of the flight. Ava's glare cut through the tension like a knife, but Derek refused to look away from the window. Her muttering continued, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, each word dripping with venom. The pilot had returned to the cockpit, satisfied the situation had calmed, but Derek knew better. The flight may have continued, but the air remained heavy with unspoken tension. Ava's presence loomed, her seething barely contained as she tightened her grip on the armrests. Every few moments, Derek could feel her eyes burning into him, but he didn't give her the satisfaction of reacting. He focused on the clouds drifting outside the window, their soft shapes blurring as the engines hummed beneath the cabin. But no amount of calm scenery could quiet the anger bubbling under the surface. He had been through worse, much worse, but hearing those words again hit a nerve he thought he had numbed long ago. "You people." A phrase that never lost its sting. Derek closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. "Breathe," he reminded himself. "Stay calm." The flight attendants quietly resumed service, but Derek caught the nervous glances they exchanged as they approached his row. Whether they were worried about Ava causing another outburst or simply eager to avoid the confrontation altogether, it was clear they were walking on eggshells. Ava, however, wasn't finished. After several minutes of scowling in his direction, she unbuckled her seatbelt with an audible click and stood once again. Derek heard the subtle shift of unease ripple through the cabin. A man across the aisle threw her a warning glance, but Ava ignored him, her lips curling into a thin, sharp sneer. She turned to face Derek directly. "Look at you," she spat, her voice low but biting. "Sitting there like you're some kind of saint. I bet you think you've done nothing wrong." Derek didn't flinch. His gaze stayed locked on the window, though his fists tightened slightly in his lap. "I know you're kind," Ava hissed, taking another step forward until she was standing in the aisle next to his row. "You don't belong here. You cause trouble. People like you make everyone around you feel unsafe." A few passengers gasped at her words, but the cabin remained eerily still. No one stepped in. Derek slowly turned his head to face her, his expression calm but unwavering. "I'm not the problem," Derek said quietly, his voice firm. "You are." Ava's eyes flared with indignation. "Me?" she snapped, her voice rising. "You've got some nerve. You've been glaring at me this whole flight, insulting me, threatening me, trying to make everyone side with you." "I haven't said a word to you," Derek replied, his tone measured but unshaken. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me." Ava's bitter laugh echoed through the cabin. "Oh, I know exactly who you are. You're just another thug who thinks he can get away with whatever he wants." Derek felt the heat rise in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral, refusing to give her the emotional response she sought. "Ma'am," Derek said slowly, "you need to sit down." "I'll sit down when I'm ready," she snapped. "People like you are the reason this country is falling apart." A murmur rippled through the rows of passengers. Whispers crept from seat to seat as people exchanged glances, some shocked, others clearly uncomfortable. Still, no one moved. At the front of the cabin, one of the flight attendants finally stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "I'm going to need you to return to your seat." Ava whipped around, her eyes blazing with anger. "Don't tell me what to do," she barked. "That man is dangerous. I'm not going to sit quietly while you let him stay on this plane." The flight attendant hesitated, uncertainty flickering in her eyes, as if she wasn't sure whether to press forward or back down. Derek stayed still, keeping his gaze locked ahead. His patience was wearing thin, but he knew better than to engage directly. "I haven't done anything to you," Derek said evenly, his voice steady despite the frustration building beneath the surface. "I suggest you take your seat." Ava's sneer deepened. "You suggest?" she mocked. "I don't take suggestions from people like you. I know exactly what you're trying to pull." The murmuring grew louder as more passengers shifted uncomfortably. Derek could see the unease spreading, but still, no one spoke up, until someone did. From behind Derek, a man rose to his feet. He was tall, solidly built, and clearly exasperated by the situation. "Ma'am," the man said firmly, "you need to calm down, now." Ava's head snapped toward him, her face contorted with fury. "Who do you think you are?" she snarled. "I'm the one being harassed here. I paid for this seat. I deserve respect." The man crossed his arms. "You're not the one being harassed. Look around. No one's on your side. You're embarrassing yourself." A few passengers nodded quietly, adding soft murmurs of agreement. Ava's face flushed red, but she wasn't ready to let go. "I'll have you all thrown off this plane," she shrieked. "You're all against me because I'm not afraid to say what everyone's thinking." Derek closed his eyes briefly, exhaling slowly. Before Ava could continue, another voice rang out, calm but absolute. "Ma'am," the voice called from the front, "you need to sit down." Derek glanced up, and there stood the pilot, his eyes narrowed with authority. The cabin fell silent. Ava's mouth opened to argue, but the pilot lifted a hand to cut her off. "This behavior will not continue," the pilot said sternly. "You either return to your seat and stop disturbing the flight, or we turn around. Your choice." For the first time, Ava hesitated. She scanned the cabin, but the passengers' disapproving stares left no room for doubt. She was alone in this. Crossing her arms tightly, she returned to her seat in a huff, glaring at Derek with pure disdain. "This isn't over," she muttered bitterly. Derek said nothing. He had seen this before. He knew it wasn't over. Ava's face burned red as she stormed back to her seat, her furious huff loud enough to echo through the otherwise silent cabin. She plopped down, crossing her arms tightly, eyes narrowing at Derek, as if daring him to make a move. Derek let out a slow breath, realizing only then how tense his shoulders had become. His heart pounded beneath his calm exterior, but years of experience kept his expression steady. He glanced around the cabin, noticing the awkward stares from other passengers. Some shot him quiet looks of sympathy, but most avoided eye contact entirely, eager to distance themselves from the unfolding confrontation. For a few moments, the plane returned to an uneasy calm. The hum of the engines seemed louder than before, as if filling the silence left by Ava's tirade. Derek hoped that maybe, just maybe, she would let it go. But deep down, he knew better. Ava wasn't the type to let things rest. People like her never were. The flight attendants resumed their duties, handing out drinks and snacks with forced smiles, but Derek caught the nervous glances they exchanged as they passed by. No one wanted to stir the pot further. Ava, however, was far from finished. "This isn't over," she muttered, just loud enough for those around her to hear. Not by a long shot. Derek kept his gaze forward, refusing to give her the reaction she craved. It didn't stop her from glaring. Her bitter energy was palpable, seeping into the surrounding rows like a cloud of smoke. Derek could feel the tension in the air, tightening like a noose. The flight was far from over, and every passing minute stretched painfully longer than the last. Across the aisle, a young boy twisted around in his seat, wide-eyed as he peered curiously at Derek. His innocent gaze stood out starkly against the nervous or judgmental glances from the other passengers. "Are you okay, mister?" the boy asked, his small voice cutting through the fog of tension. Derek blinked and managed a soft smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm fine," Derek replied gently. "Thanks for asking." The boy's mother, clearly aware of the situation, tugged him back into his seat, whispering something into his ear. The boy nodded but continued to sneak glances at Derek, his curiosity unshaken. Derek's thoughts drifted as he leaned back into his seat, memories surfacing uninvited. He remembered his first day at the bureau, young, eager, and full of hope. He had wanted to make a difference, to prove he belonged, despite the doubters who saw only his skin color, not his skill. He had proven them wrong. Over and over. Ava had no idea who she was messing with. The thought gave him some comfort, but it didn't erase the simmering frustration beneath the surface. He shifted in his seat, glancing at his watch. Still 2 more hours to go. But the quiet didn't last long. Ava's seatbelt clicked again, louder this time, and Derek braced himself as she rose. He watched from the corner of his eye as she stomped toward the front of the plane, her heels clicking against the floor. The collective exhale from passengers around her was unmistakable. Eyes rolled, heads shook, but no one said a word. "This is unacceptable." Ava's voice cut through the cabin, loud enough for half the plane to hear. She waved down a flight attendant, her finger jabbing toward Derek's row. "You're letting that man stay on this flight when he's making everyone uncomfortable? Are you people insane? He's probably a criminal." The flight attendant, a middle-aged woman with lines of exhaustion creasing her face, sighed and approached Ava calmly. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," the flight attendant said, her tone patient but firm. "We've asked you multiple times to calm down." Ava's face deepened to a shade of red. Derek had only seen during interrogations when suspects cracked under pressure. "Calm down?" Ava's voice wavered but grew louder. "You expect me to calm down while he's just sitting there, acting like he owns the place?" She gestured dramatically toward Derek. Derek watched silently, knowing what was coming next. "I demand to see some ID from him," Ava screeched. "I'll bet he doesn't even belong here. He could be a threat. You need to do your jobs and check if he's—" "Ma'am." The word was sharp and cutting, coming not from the flight attendant, but from a passenger a few rows ahead. A man with salt and pepper hair and the commanding voice of someone who didn't suffer fools rose from his seat. "That's enough," the man said, his gaze hard as steel. Ava turned sharply, her expression twisted with indignation. "Excuse me? You don't know what's going on," she snapped. "I know exactly what's going on," the man replied coolly, "and I think everyone here does too." A few murmurs rippled through the cabin. Passengers began nodding in quiet agreement. Ava's lips pressed into a thin line, but she wasn't backing down. "I'm trying to protect this flight," she insisted. "You can't be too careful these days." The man shook his head. "The only danger on this flight is you." Derek suppressed a smirk, though he remained silent. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the weight of the other passengers tipping away from Ava and toward him. The flight attendant stepped forward again. "Ma'am," she said, her voice sterner now, "please return to your seat, or we will be forced to notify the captain." Ava's eyes flickered uncertainly toward the cockpit. For a brief moment she hesitated, realizing she was losing ground. But she wasn't done yet. "Fine," Ava huffed, stomping back toward her seat. "But don't blame me when something happens." She shot Derek one last venomous glare before sitting down, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Derek exhaled, returning his focus to the window. It wasn't over. He could feel it, not by a long shot. Ava's voice rose like a siren, drawing unwanted attention from every corner of the plane. "What if he's dangerous?" she demanded, her glare fixed on Derek. "He could be a terrorist for all you know." The flight attendant's eyes widened, momentarily stunned. She blinked, clearly at a loss for words. "Ma'am," the attendant replied carefully, "we cannot ask passengers for identification once they've boarded. Everyone here has already passed through security." "That's not good enough," Ava snapped, shaking her head in disbelief. "He doesn't belong here. I can feel it." Derek's pulse quickened, but his face remained neutral. He'd handled accusations far worse in his line of work. Losing his cool wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he scanned the faces around him. Some passengers appeared horrified by Ava's words, while others looked tired, as if this kind of scene was nothing new. Before the flight attendant could respond, a man seated a few rows ahead rose to his feet. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and exuded an air of authority. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady and calm, "you need to sit down. You're the only one causing a problem here." Ava spun toward him, eyes blazing. "And who do you think you are?" she hissed. "You don't know anything about what's going on. You should be thanking me for keeping you all safe." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "You're not keeping anyone safe," he replied flatly. "You're making this worse." A soft murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. A few passengers nodded, exchanging quiet glances. Ava's face twisted with fury. "Oh, so now you're all against me?" She snapped. I'm the only one with the guts to say what everyone else is thinking, and this is the thanks I get? Derek kept his eyes forward, letting the situation unfold without stepping in. He knew from experience that responding now would only fuel her fire. Let her bury herself, he thought. The flight attendant's patience appeared to wear thin. She stepped closer to Ava, her tone sharper than before. "Ma'am, this is your final warning," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Return to your seat or we will have no choice but to make an emergency landing." Ava's eyes widened as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You're going to throw me off the plane?" she gasped, pointing toward Derek. "Not him?" The attendant's voice was unwavering. "That man has done nothing wrong. You, on the other hand, are disturbing the peace." The weight of the moment hung heavy. Ava's eyes darted around the cabin, searching for an ally. But there were none. Passengers stared back at her with disapproving glances. Some shook their heads in silent judgment. Ava's bravado seemed to falter under the pressure. For a moment, Derek thought she might actually sit down and let it go. But then, with a final huff, she hissed, "You're all blind. You don't know what people like him are capable of." The flight attendant subtly signaled toward the front of the plane, catching the attention of a colleague. Derek watched, sensing the shift in the air. "Ma'am," the attendant said, her voice hardening, "if you don't sit down right now, we'll have to call for backup." Ava's fists clenched at her sides. Derek could tell she was on the verge of snapping, her rage bubbling just beneath the surface. But before she could lash out, the tall man stepped into the aisle, positioning himself between Ava and the rest of the passengers. "Enough," he said, his voice firm and commanding. "Sit down." Ava blinked, clearly thrown off by the sudden force in his tone. For once, she hesitated. Her mouth opened as if to argue, but the hard set of the man's jaw made her reconsider. Slowly, begrudgingly, Ava retreated to her seat, slamming herself down with exaggerated frustration. Her face was flushed with humiliation, and her eyes burned with resentment. The tension in the cabin seemed to deflate as the flight attendant nodded in quiet thanks to the tall man and returned to her duties. Derek sat silently, his hands resting on his knees, though his mind raced. He knew Ava wasn't done. This was just a lull in the storm. Passengers around him whispered quietly, exchanging relieved glances. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Derek felt the subtle weight of their eyes flicker his way now and then. Some expressions were sympathetic, while others carried awkward uncertainty. A man sitting across the aisle caught Derek's gaze and gave him a small nod. A gesture of support. Derek acknowledged it with the faintest dip of his head, but didn't linger. He wasn't looking for validation or comfort. He just wanted the flight to end without further drama. Minutes passed, and the attendants resumed service, passing through the aisles with refreshments. Conversations gradually resumed, but the tension lingered beneath the surface. Every so often, Derek caught snippets of hushed conversations. "Can you believe that woman?" someone whispered. "How embarrassing for her," another muttered. Derek kept his focus on the window, watching the clouds roll past as the plane cruised steadily toward San Francisco. But even as the hum of conversation filled the cabin, Derek could still feel Ava's eyes burning into the back of his head. Derek could feel Ava's stare boring into the back of his head, her anger radiating like heat off pavement. Though she had been temporarily silenced, the tension in the cabin lingered, clinging to the air like smoke that refused to clear. He kept his eyes on the in-flight magazine resting on the tray table in front of him. But the words blurred together, impossible to focus on. It wasn't the first time he'd been the target of someone like Ava, loud, entitled, and unwilling to let go of her prejudices. But something about this moment gnawed at him. Ava wasn't just muttering under her breath now. She was waiting for an excuse. Across the aisle, the man sitting next to Ava shifted uneasily. He had been silent throughout the ordeal, visibly uncomfortable but unwilling to get involved. Now, however, Derek noticed him glance in Ava's direction before shooting a nervous look toward Derek. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man cleared his throat and spoke softly. "Ma'am," he muttered, his tone low but firm, "I think you've said enough." Ava's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing in irritation. "Excuse me?" she hissed, incredulous. "Who do you think you are?" The man swallowed, visibly hesitant but unwilling to back down. "You're making everyone uncomfortable," he said. "Just let it go, all right?" Ava's lips curled into a bitter sneer. "Let it go?" she repeated, her voice rising once again. "I'm the only one here who sees the truth. You should be thanking me for trying to keep us all safe." The man rubbed his temples, shaking his head. "He's not a threat. You are." Ava's knuckles whitened as she gripped the armrests of her seat, clearly holding herself back from unleashing more fury. Derek could see the anger bubbling beneath the surface, ready to boil over. After a tense moment, Ava let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "You're all blind," she muttered loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "You don't know what people like him are capable of." Derek shifted slightly, exhaling through his nose as his patience wore thin. He wasn't new to this. His years in the FBI had prepared him for confrontations with far more dangerous individuals. But somehow, this felt different. Because it wasn't about his job. This wasn't a suspect on the other side of the table. This was a woman who thought she could degrade him because of the color of his skin. He considered getting up, maybe asking a flight attendant for some space. But he knew that would only escalate things and give Ava another excuse to attack. He stayed put, gripping the edges of the tray table to keep his composure. But Ava wasn't finished. Just when Derek thought the tension had peaked, she stood up again. This time, her eyes locked onto him directly, her lips curling into a condescending smile. "I don't know why everyone's so scared to say the truth," Ava announced loudly, ensuring her words carried across the cabin. "I've seen his type before. They get away with whatever they want, because people like you." She gestured toward the passengers, are too afraid to call them out. "But not me. I'm not scared." A ripple of discomfort swept through the nearby rows. A few gasps escaped, and Derek noticed passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. His jaw clenched, but he kept his gaze forward, trying to keep his cool. Ava took a small step forward, clearly testing the waters. "What's the matter?" she taunted. "Can't defend yourself?" "Of course not. People like you never can." Before Derek could respond, a sharp, authoritative voice cut through the air. "That's enough." Derek glanced up to see the same flight attendant from earlier, standing just a few feet away. Her posture was rigid, and her expression left no room for argument. "Ma'am," the attendant said, her voice low but commanding, "this is your final warning. If you don't sit down and stop harassing this passenger, we will have no choice but to take action." For the first time, Ava hesitated. She glanced around the cabin, and the reality of the situation seemed to sink in. No one, not even the man next to her, would come to her defense. Passengers stared at her with open disdain, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Even the murmurs had died down, replaced by a thick, expectant silence. Ava opened her mouth, as if preparing to argue, but nothing came out. Instead, she dropped heavily into her seat, crossing her arms with a loud huff. The flight attendant lingered for a moment, her eyes still fixed on Ava. Then, with a final nod, she turned and walked back toward the front of the plane. Derek let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The silence lingered, but for now, Ava was quiet. For now. Derek didn't relax, though. He knew better than to think this was over. Ava wasn't the type to let things go so easily. He could still feel her glare on the back of his head, even as he pretended to read the magazine in his hands. The cabin had returned to an uneasy calm, but the storm hadn't passed. Derek could sense it, the undercurrent still brewing just beneath the surface, waiting for the smallest spark to set it off again. Derek's eyes skimmed over the magazine in his lap, but the words blurred, meaningless under the weight of what had just happened. He had handled life-threatening operations and volatile suspects, yet the humiliation of being targeted for his skin color, in front of strangers, stung in a way no mission ever had. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking through his thoughts. Grateful for the distraction, he retrieved it and glanced at the screen. A message from his supervisor. It was a brief update on the operation he'd been involved in prior to boarding this flight. Derek's heart thumped a little faster as he read. The mission's timing was crucial, and his role was key to ensuring its success. Without hesitation, he typed a quick response, confirming that he would land as planned and head straight to the designated meetup. Even as the tension lingered around him, his focus shifted momentarily to the job ahead. This was what mattered most. The situation with Ava, as aggravating as it was, paled in comparison to what was waiting for him after landing. Sliding his phone back into his pocket, Derek exhaled and settled deeper into his seat, attempting to find some semblance of calm. Around him, the hum of conversation had begun to return, though faint traces of unease still colored the atmosphere. Occasionally, Derek noticed lingering stares, a mixture of pity and curiosity from nearby passengers. They didn't know how to react. He had seen it before. People weren't sure what to do when confronted with racism directly. Most preferred to stay silent, hoping the issue would resolve itself. Derek let his shoulders relax. Maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind him. But Ava wasn't done. Her voice slithered through the cabin once again, quieter now, but no less venomous. She leaned across the aisle, speaking in hushed tones to the man beside her. Derek couldn't make out every word, but he heard enough. Shouldn't even be here. Criminals like him, disgusting. The man next to her shifted, clearly uncomfortable. He nodded absently, but avoided eye contact, seemingly desperate to escape the conversation. Still, Ava pressed on, her relentless need to justify herself making the moment unbearable. Derek tried to ignore her, but the ugly remarks gnawed at him. His years of training had taught him patience, the ability to withstand pressure in hostile environments. But Ava's arrogance, her complete disregard for decency, tested the very limits of that patience. The flight attendants, meanwhile, seemed acutely aware of the tension. They passed by Ava's row more frequently than before, shooting nervous glances in her direction, but hesitated to step in again. The unspoken line had been drawn. Everyone was waiting, uncertain if or when Ava would cross it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom, announcing the plane's descent. Derek welcomed the distraction. Passengers adjusted their seats and tucked away their trays, shifting their focus to the upcoming landing. But Ava wasn't interested in quieting down. As the plane tilted slightly, preparing for descent, Derek caught sight of her rising from her seat. Despite the seatbelt sign glowing brightly above her head, Ava unbuckled, rummaging for her bag in the overhead compartment. A ripple of concern spread through the cabin. A flight attendant, visibly tense, hurried toward her. "Ma'am, you need to sit down," the attendant said, her voice firm but polite. "We're preparing for landing." Ava didn't even glance her way. "I'm getting my bag," Ava snapped as if the rules didn't apply to her. "Ma'am, sit down now," the attendant repeated, her tone hardening. Ava's eyes flashed with indignation. "Do you know who I am?" she barked, raising her voice for all to hear. A few nearby passengers exchanged exasperated glances. The attendant remained composed. "If you don't sit down, ma'am, we'll have to report this to the authorities upon landing." For a fleeting second, Ava hesitated. Her gaze flickered toward the front of the plane, as if weighing the risk of continuing the confrontation. But she doubled down. Arms crossed defiantly, she let out a sharp breath. "Go ahead," Ava sneered. "I'm not the one you should be worried about." Her eyes cut back to Derek, filled with loathing. "Why don't you ask him what he's hiding?" The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop as heads turned in Derek's direction. It was as if time slowed. Passengers who had been minding their own business were now openly staring, their curiosity piqued by Ava's words. The flight attendant's eyes darted between Derek and Ava, frustration etched into her face. "Ma'am," the attendant said through clenched teeth, "sit down." Ava crossed her arms tighter, shaking her head. "No," she shot back. "I want answers. What's he doing here? Why won't anyone listen to me? He could be dangerous." Derek felt the weight of every gaze pressing down on him. The absurdity of Ava's accusations hung in the air, thick and suffocating. But even as the whisper spread, Derek didn't move. He had seen this before, the way fear could infect a crowd, turning even rational people into bystanders of ignorance. But Derek wasn't just any passenger. And soon enough, everyone was going to find out exactly who he was. Derek sat still, his fingers pressed lightly against his knee, trying to keep his breathing even. Ava's accusations, as ridiculous as they were, had begun to seep into the minds of a few passengers. The murmur of whispers passed quietly between them like an undercurrent of doubt. This was how it always started. He could see it clearly, the way uncertainty twisted logic, how fear fed off ignorance. Ava's words were baseless, but sometimes that didn't matter. Another flight attendant approached, this one exuding a sense of authority that hadn't been there before. Her eyes locked on Ava, her patience worn thin. "Ma'am," the attendant said, her voice sharp and unwavering, "you need to sit down immediately, or you will be removed from the plane upon landing." For a brief moment, Ava hesitated. Her gaze swept across the cabin, perhaps searching for someone to back her up. But the silence that followed was deafening. No one spoke. Not even the man seated beside her, who now leaned as far away from Ava as his seat would allow. With no support to embolden her, Ava finally let out an exaggerated huff and dropped into her seat, arms crossed like a petulant child. Derek exhaled softly, releasing the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. But it wasn't over. Even as the plane descended, Ava's rage simmered beneath the surface. He could feel her eyes on him, her stare hot with hatred. "Unbelievable," she muttered just loud enough for the passengers around her to hear. "They'll let anyone on planes these days. Don't even know who's dangerous anymore." Derek closed his eyes briefly, forcing himself to let the words slide off. He'd endured far worse. Still, he could sense the ripple effect, the subtle shift in posture from passengers who, moments before, had seemed indifferent. A few were now glancing at him with hesitation, uncertainty clouding their expressions. The power of suggestion. It was one thing for Ava to spew ignorance. It was another to watch people wrestle with it, unsure where they stood. The plane touched down smoothly, the soft bump of the landing gear a welcome distraction from the weight of the cabin's tension. Engines whirred softly as the aircraft taxied to the gate. For most passengers, landing brought relief. For Derek, it was just the beginning. He could feel it coming. The inevitable escalation. Ava wasn't the type to simply walk away. And sure enough, the second the seatbelt sign flicked off with a ding, she shot up from her seat. Derek watched silently as Ava stormed toward the front of the plane, bypassing passengers who were still gathering their belongings. "I need to speak to the pilot," Ava snapped, her voice cutting through the cabin. Heads turned. Conversations paused. Even the flight attendants, who had been calmly preparing for disembarkation, froze for a moment. A flight attendant quickly stepped forward, blocking Ava's path with an outstretched arm. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," she said, her tone professional but firm. Ava didn't slow down. "I need to speak to the pilot," Ava repeated, louder this time. Her finger shot out, stabbing toward Derek's seat. "This plane isn't safe. That man could be dangerous. I don't know why no one's listening to me." Derek shifted slightly, feeling the weight of every passenger's eyes gravitate back toward him. Some looked confused, others annoyed. The whispers returned, louder now. "Ma'am," the flight attendant said through clenched teeth, stepping into Ava's path, "you need to calm down. Any further disruption will result in security meeting us at the gate." Ava's lip curled into a sneer. "No, this is an issue. You're all ignoring me," she snapped, eyes darting around the cabin, desperate for validation. "I'm trying to keep everyone safe, and you're just letting him sit there like nothing's wrong." Passengers exchanged glances, some rolling their eyes while others shifted uncomfortably. Derek held his ground, refusing to rise from his seat, let her hang herself with her own words. The flight attendant leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a lower, more dangerous register. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again. Sit down." Ava stood her ground, arms folded tightly across her chest, but Derek could see it. The flicker of doubt behind her eyes. She glanced around once more, but the faces staring back at her held nothing but disapproval. Even the man who had initially been sitting beside her now avoided her gaze, pretending to rifle through his carry-on. Realizing she was alone, Ava let out a frustrated growl and reluctantly slumped into a nearby seat. "This isn't over," she hissed under her breath. Derek finally looked up, his gaze steady. "I know," he replied quietly. The moment lingered, heavy with unspoken words. But one thing was clear. Ava was losing the room. Derek sat quietly, feeling the cabin's gaze weigh heavier with every second that passed. Ava stood near the exit, arms folded tightly across her chest as if she had just won some twisted battle. Her smug expression practically dared anyone to challenge her. The pilot emerged from the cockpit, his brow furrowed with controlled annoyance. He scanned the cabin, his eyes settling on Ava. "Ma'am, what seems to be the problem here?" the pilot asked, his tone professional but strained. Clearly, he was eager to end this as quickly as possible. Ava wasted no time. "The problem is him," she spat, pointing directly at Derek. "I don't feel safe with him on this plane. I don't know what he's up to, but I know something isn't right." The pilot's eyes shifted to Derek, calm but questioning. Then back to Ava, his confusion evident. "Ma'am, please calm down," the pilot replied carefully. "There's no indication that anyone on this flight is a danger." Ava's face reddened with frustration. "Are you serious?" she snapped. "You're just going to ignore a legitimate concern? I want him off this plane, and I want security to check him out. This is unacceptable." Derek kept his gaze steady, choosing not to respond. He could feel the heat rising beneath his skin, but he knew better than to let it show. He had been through worse, but that didn't make this any easier. The pilot let out a slow breath, clearly at the edge of his patience. "Ma'am, we can address your concerns once the plane has landed," he said firmly. "Right now, I need you to return to your seat. If you continue to cause a disturbance, we'll have no choice but to call airport security." For a fleeting moment, Ava seemed rattled. Her eyes darted nervously around the cabin. But then she straightened her shoulders, doubling down. "Good, call them," Ava said sharply, crossing her arms. "They need to deal with him before something happens." The flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances. The situation had reached a boiling point, and Ava's refusal to let go left them with little choice. One of the attendants, a woman in her early 50s, discreetly picked up the intercom phone. Her voice was calm, but Derek caught the tension beneath it. "We need security at the gate, please." The words sent a ripple of unease through the cabin. Derek remained seated, calm and composed, though inside he could feel the tension ratcheting higher. Ava's triumphant glare pierced him from across the aisle, as if she had just unraveled some grand conspiracy. Passengers began to gather their belongings as the plane taxied to the gate, but Derek could see the subtle shift in their behavior. People now gave him a wide berth, as if afraid to get too close, distancing themselves from the situation Ava had manufactured. He watched as they filed past, their eyes flicking toward him, uncertain and wary. Ava lingered by the exit, still eyeing him with suspicion, as if her mere presence validated her paranoia. Derek leaned back, clasping his hands together in his lap, waiting for the inevitable confrontation to begin. He wasn't going to run. He wanted to see how far this would go. The sound of heavy footsteps soon echoed up the jet bridge. Two security officers boarded the plane, their expressions serious but neutral. They exchanged brief glances, clearly unsure of what to expect. "There he is," Ava blurted before anyone could speak, pointing directly at Derek. "He's the one I was telling you about. I don't feel safe with him on board. You need to check him out." The officers approached Derek cautiously, moving slowly as if preparing for some kind of conflict. Derek remained still, his posture relaxed. He understood the optics. A wrong move could shift the situation in the blink of an eye. "Sir," one of the officers said, polite but firm, "can you come with us for a moment?" Derek nodded without hesitation. "Of course," he replied smoothly, gathering his things. As Derek stood, he felt the cabin's collective gaze narrow further. Passengers whispered among themselves, their curiosity rising to match the tension. Ava stepped aside, smirking as if she had just delivered the final blow. "I knew something was off," she muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Derek didn't look at her. Instead, he followed the officers down the aisle, his movements slow and deliberate. The tension was suffocating, wrapping around him like a vice. As they stepped onto the jet bridge, Derek could hear the faint hum of conversations spilling from the cabin behind him. Passengers had been frozen in place, watching closely, but none had intervened. Derek wasn't surprised. He'd seen it before, the silent approval, the reluctance to challenge prejudice head-on. But Derek also knew something that Ava didn't. He could feel the weight of his badge in his pocket, and soon enough, so would everyone else. Derek stepped off the plane, the cool rush of airport air brushing against his face. The two security officers flanked him as they led him toward a small holding area near the gate. Ava followed closely behind, arms folded tightly across her chest, her expression smug and expectant. She stood a few feet away, leaning forward slightly as if anticipating some grand fallout from her complaint. Her eyes gleamed with satisfaction, convinced she was moments away from exposing Derek as some kind of threat. Derek could almost hear her thoughts, how she imagined herself as the hero of this story. One of the officers cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Sir, we received a report about suspicious behavior on the flight," the officer said, his tone neutral but firm. "Can you explain what happened?" Derek inhaled deeply, keeping his voice calm and measured. "Before I explain," Derek replied smoothly, "there's something you should see." Slowly he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. His movements were deliberate, ensuring not to alarm the officers. He pulled out his wallet and flipped it open, revealing a sleek, polished badge that glimmered under the airport's fluorescent lights. The golden letters read, "Federal Bureau of Investigation." The officers leaned in slightly, their eyes narrowing as they took a closer look. Derek watched their expressions shift from confusion to quiet recognition. Ava's grin evaporated in an instant. Her eyes widened, flickering between Derek and the badge, as if struggling to process what she was seeing. Derek held the badge steadily, allowing the weight of the moment to sink in. "I'm Special Agent Derek Cole, FBI," he said, locking eyes with the officers. "I've been traveling for work. If you need to verify my credentials, feel free to contact my office." The two officers exchanged uneasy glances, the realization sinking in that this wasn't the confrontation they had been expecting. Agent Cole," one of the officers stammered, his face flushing with embarrassment. "Apologies for the misunderstanding. We were just responding to the report." Derek gave a curt nod. "I understand," he replied. "You're just doing your job." But when his eyes shifted toward Ava, his gaze hardened. Her mouth hung open, lips trembling as she fumbled for an explanation. The confidence she carried moments before was gone, replaced by something far more fragile. "Wait, you're FBI?" She sputtered, the words catching in her throat. I didn't know. I thought." Derek's eyes didn't waver. "You thought what?" he asked quietly. "That I was a threat because of the color of my skin?" Ava stumbled over her words, unable to meet his gaze. I didn't know." "No," Derek interrupted, his voice firm but calm. "You didn't know, but that didn't stop you from assuming the worst." Passengers who had gathered nearby began murmuring amongst themselves, watching Ava with visible judgment. The people who had once sat silently during her tirade now saw her for exactly what she was, not the hero she imagined, but the antagonist of her own creation. Ava shrank beneath the weight of their stares. The officer nearest to Derek shifted awkwardly, trying to cut the tension. "Agent Cole, you're free to go," the officer said with a small nod. "We'll handle the rest from here." Derek straightened his shoulders, offering a polite, "Thank you, I appreciate your professionalism." As he turned to leave, Ava, still in disbelief, took a hesitant step forward. "Wait, I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said, her voice wavering. I didn't know." Derek stopped and looked at her over his shoulder, his eyes sharp and unwavering. "That's the thing, Ava," he said. "You could have just minded your own business, but instead, you chose to escalate a situation that didn't exist." His words hung heavy in the air, cutting through her excuses like glass. "And now," Derek added quietly, "you'll have to live with the consequences." Ava stood frozen in place, her mouth opening slightly but no words coming out. Derek walked away, his calm, steady stride a stark contrast to the storm Ava had tried to create. As the onlookers slowly dispersed, casting cold glances in Ava's direction, the officers escorted her to a nearby seating area where she was left to stew in her humiliation. Derek re-entered the terminal, blending seamlessly into the crowd, his badge tucked away once more. For him, it was just another day, another reminder of how far society still had to go. But as he stepped forward, he found solace in the knowledge that moments like these, where truth triumphed over ignorance, were what made all the difference. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring and thought-provoking stories. And let us know, where are you watching from today?